This is the story of an axe, an apple, and a buckskin jacket. Young Jethro was his name. In the dark wilderness of Kentucky, where he lived, more than 100 years ago, the forest of ash trees and hickory was so thick you couldn't see the sun coming up without bending far to the right or to the left to get a fairly clear view of what was going on. No matter where young Jethro stood, there always seemed to be a tree in front of him. But there was a clearing in the forest, and in the middle of the clearing stood the cabin his father had built. The cabin was the only home young Jethro had ever known. Sometimes, from the little attic bedroom where he slept on a corn husk mattress, young Jethro could see the sky through a small crack in the roof. From his pillow, he could look up at night and see 2, maybe 3, stars. But he knew there were more stars than that, because he had seen them from outside the cabin door. In the early evening, when he looked directly upward, the sky looked like a blanket sprinkled with sugar. When he was 5 years old, young Jethro had asked his father how big the sky was, and his father had said, "It was as far as the eye could see." At the time, young Jethro thought that was very big indeed. But now that he was 7, he knew from the way his father talked that it must be even bigger. "There must be a lot of sky I've never seen," young Jethro decided. The way it was now, he figured, the sky was made up of about 59 stars, maybe 62. But he wasn't sure of the exact number because in winter there seemed to be so many more of them. The crisp, chill air was clearer then, and there were times on certain nights when the air seemed so clear he thought he could reach up with a long corn broom and brush the stars with its tip. This was especially true in December, around the time of Christmas, when the days were shorter and the nights were longer than at any other time of the year. Looking at that patch of sky above the forest always filled young Jethro with a secret wish. He wanted to make the sky bigger. But he thought the only way to make the sky bigger would be to clear away more of the trees. In the daytime, Jethro would watch his father chopping down trees to make the clearing in the forest bigger. His father hoped to make it big enough for a field of hay and a pasture where they could graze some cows. Young Jethro tried to help his father as best he could, but how many trees can a small boy chop down in a day? Not very many, especially if he doesn't have an axe of his own. Lucky if he gets a few bushes. So young Jethro used to say to his father, "I sure wish I had me a magical axe. I'd pitch in there and chop down 100 trees in no time at all. Then maybe we'd have room for a garden patch and space for an apple tree." "Is that all you want, an axe and an apple?" his father asked him. "Well, I sure got a hankering for something else," young Jethro replied. "But I hate to be dreaming for things that are hard to get." Now, the thing that young Jethro was really hankering for was a buckskin jacket. A buckskin jacket with fringe on it. Often by the fireplace at night, his father told him stories of great adventures. And the stories young Jethro liked best were ones about Daniel Boone, who had first discovered the wilderness, Daniel Boone had worn a buckskin jacket, and that was the one thing young Jethro was longing to get. But he knew there wasn't much he could do about it. All he could do was dream, like his dream of making the clearing in the forest bigger, so he could see more of the sky.
An axe, an apple, and a buckskin jacket. Oh, what a sight they'd be. An axe, an apple, and a buckskin jacket. That's all I want for me.
Now, their cabin was so far from any kind of store, and young Jethro and his father had been so busy clearing away the fields that nothing had been done about Christmas. So there it was, along about noon the very day before Christmas, when his father said to young Jethro, "Son, you'd better start to get ready now. We're all going down to the crossroads store with a few eggs and some winter squash to see what we can swap 'em for." That's the way they got most of the things they needed, in exchange for eggs and vegetables, and sometimes cherry bark and sassafras, which the storekeeper used for making cough syrup and tea. Actually, there wasn't anything young Jethro liked better than going down to that crossroads store. But this time he surprised his father by saying, "Don't rightly think I care to come along this time, if you don't mind. Rather just stay here and keep an eye on the place." His father knew from the casual way he said it that young Jethro must have had something important in mind. So he decided not to ask questions. "Well, you do what you think best," he said. "You've got your dog Pepper here for company, so we'll not have to worry. We'll be back before sundown anyhow, so you do as you like and keep a lookout till we get back." So young Jethro stayed behind while his mother and father hid it out through the forest. His mother carried a large basket of eggs, and his father carried a sack over his shoulder filled with winter squash. He also had a roll of peeled cherry bark under his arm and a sheaf of sassafras, things they could swap for a lot of wonderful goods at the store. When they had disappeared behind the trees, which didn't take long in such a thick forest, young Jethro sat down on the cabin steps and wished he hadn't decided to stay behind after all. Suddenly it felt terribly silent and lonely. A chickadee chirped in one of the bushes near the dooryard, and a blue jay chattered in one of the tall trees far in the distance. But aside from that, there wasn't a sound in the forest. Pepper whined at his elbow and tried to get Jethro to play with him. But young Jethro didn't feel like playing because he had something on his mind. "By golly, Pepper, what are we going to get Ma and Pa for Christmas?" Then, out of the corner of his eye, young Jethro noticed his father's axe beside the cabin door. "I know what," he shouted. "I'm going to chop down all those trees and pull up all those stumps. By the time Ma and Pa get back, there'll be plenty of room for a garden patch and maybe some space for an apple tree." Young Jethro pulled off the woolly sweater his mother had knit for him. He grabbed the axe by the handle, and for a minute or two, it almost seemed light enough for him to swing with ease. He crossed the clearing to the first big balsam tree and began to chop. That is, he tried to chop, but the axe was too big, and young Jethro was too small. All he could do was make a few nicks in the side of the tree, hardly enough to peel off the bark. As he was struggling with the weight of the axe, a few flakes of snow began to fall. Evening and darkness always come earlier when it's snowing, and soon young Jethro had to drag the axe back to the cabin. By that time it felt so heavy he could hardly lift it up to its place on the wall. He put on his woolly sweater again and stood outside the cabin trying to see the sky. It was so dark by now he could hardly see the tops of the trees. He went inside the cabin and lit a lantern to give him some light. And then he waited by the window. The snow must be holding Ma and Pa up, Jethro said to Pepper. Hours later, or so it seemed to him, there was still nobody in sight. The snow had stopped falling, and the moon was out. By pressing his nose to the window, he could see a small patch of sky. He tried to count the stars. This time he counted to 71. The air was that clear. The trees at the edge of the clearing were bent low with the weight of the snow, and young Jethro noticed a strange thing. One of the biggest trees looked like a lumberjack wearing a heavy mackinaw. One of the smaller trees, a kind of bushy one, looked like a man with a pack on his back. And the balsam he had tried to chop down looked like a frontiersman in a buckskin jacket. The icicles looked like fringe. Was he dreaming to see such things? Young Jethro wasn't sure. It's hard to know, especially around Christmas time, when a boy is dreaming and when he's awake. Suddenly, young Jethro was startled by the sound of knocking at the cabin door. That's them, he thought, thinking of his mother and father. That's them. Thank goodness they were home at last. He opened the door, but when he looked outside, all he could see was a huge pair of leather boots. He poked his head out the doorway and looked up. And there he saw a pair of legs. He looked even higher, like a telescope aimed at the stars. And there he saw a man as tall as the tallest tree. "Who are you?" young Jethro called out. He tried to keep his voice from quivering so this giant of a man wouldn't think he was afraid. The voice came back like an echo in a deep cave. "Paul Bunyan's my name." Young Jethro had heard about Paul Bunyan from his father. Paul Bunyan was known all over the frontier country as the mightiest lumberjack of them all. He could clear away all the trees in an entire county in a single day. And when he ate flapjacks in the morning, it took 6 cooks to make his breakfast. But what was he doing out here? "I brought you an axe," Paul Bunyan said. "A magical axe, just your size." He reached deep into the pocket of his mackinaw jacket and took out an axe. In his enormous hands, it looked like a tiny hatchet. He reached down and carefully placed the handle in young Jethro's hands. Paul Bunyan was right. The axe fitted young Jethro perfectly. "That's truly a magical axe," Paul Bunyan said. "It'll chop down any tree in 7 strokes. You try it and see. Young Jethro looked at the gleaming blade with an admiring eye. He knew how sharp his father's axe had to be in order to make a clean cut in the side of a tree, and this axe looked as sharp as any he had ever seen. He looked skyward to Paul Bunyan. "Thank you," he shouted happily. "Thank you mightily. If this axe really works, 7 strokes to a tree, I can clear away that field before Ma and Pa get back, and that'll be the best Christmas surprise of all." He hitched up his trousers, buttoned up his jacket, and crossed to the biggest tree in the entire forest. It was so tall, he had to lean over backwards to see the top. Paul Bunyan watched over him and said, "Now you be careful to make it fall in the right direction. Take 4 strokes from the right side and make a wedge. Then take 3 strokes from the left side to lop her off. That way she'll topple whichever way you want." Young Jethro had seen his father do the same thing with saplings when he chopped them down for kindling wood. But he never dreamed 7 strokes would take down so huge a tree. So he lined himself up before the tree, making up in his mind exactly which way he wanted it to fall. When he was sure of the right direction, he blazed away. The first stroke cut so deeply, it left the axe trembling in his hands. The second and third strokes cut even deeper. He had to tug to pull the handle out. The fourth stroke cut clean across the others, and the chips seemed to spit across the ground around his feet. But there it was, 4 strokes and a perfect wedge. Then young Jethro went to the opposite side of the tree and blazed away again. 1, 2, 3. At the third stroke, there was a great crackling of branches above him, followed by a heavy swooshing sound. "Timber! Timber!" Young Jethro jumped aside as the giant tree crumpled like a helpless log. He could hardly believe his eyes. But time was a-wasting, and he hurried to the next tree. "Now you be careful which trees you chop down," Paul Bunyan cautioned him. "No use going hog wild. A tree is the best friend a man can have. First thing you got to learn is how to clear 'em proper." So young Jethro followed his advice and cleared the forest just the way Paul Bunyan liked it. By this time, the clearing was much bigger, and young Jethro was sure that if he looked up, he'd see 1,000 stars instead of 59 or 71. But he felt a little tuckered out from all his labors, and he thought it was time to rest a bit. He asked Paul Bunyan to join him in the cabin, but Paul only laughed and said, "Sorry, I can't do that. I can only put my boot through the door, but it'll warm my toes. Do you mind?" Paul Bunyan stood outside the cabin with one foot in the doorway, and the toe of his boot stretched all the way over to the fireplace. "Ouch!" he yelled. "I put it too close to the fire." He pulled his foot away so fast he almost knocked the cabin over. "Careful!" young Jethro hollered. But Paul grabbed the chimney with one hand and steadied the walls with the other so the cabin wouldn't topple over. As they warmed themselves by the fire, young Jethro heard somebody singing. He went to the door of the cabin and looked out at the smoldering twilight. There, on the other side of the clearing, he could just make out a man. He was not a very large man. From a distance, he looked like a gnome. As a matter of fact, he was so short that his shoulders only came up to the laces of Paul Bunyan's boot. And on his head, he wore a tin pot instead of a hat. Young Jethro knew at once it was Johnny Appleseed. He'd heard about Johnny from his mother. She told Jethro his real name was John Chapman, but everyone called him Johnny Appleseed because he always carried a sack of apple seeds and walked all over the West, planting apple trees.
Appleseed, I've come to plant my seeds indeed. I've come to plant them in the ground. They'll blossom soon for miles around.
Young Jethro watched Johnny Appleseed as he came closer and closer until he was outside the cabin door. Johnny Appleseed stood there in the moonlight, almost up to his hips in snow. And he bowed low, like an actor on his own private stage. "When I heard you chopping away and clearing off the field," Johnny Appleseed said, "I figured I'd better hurry out here and give you a present, just to show my gratitude." He clambered over Paul Bunyan's boot, which was blocking the doorway, and joined young Jethro inside the cabin. He huddled close to the fire, took an apple from his pack, and held it up to the light. "You see that apple?" he said. The dark red skin looked as though it had been waxed and polished. It was that shiny. "You take the seeds from this here apple," Johnny continued, "and plant 'em in the ground when April comes. Then you hoe 'em to keep the bugs away. Soon they'll grow into trees, and the first thing you know, they'll bear you the nicest fruit you ever did see." Young Jethro took the apple in his hand. He turned it round and round against the fireplace light. He could almost see his face in the shiny, gleaming skin. He almost wanted to eat it. Johnny Appleseed could see what was in Jethro's mind. He said, "Go ahead and eat it. Just remember to save the seeds. That's the thing about apples. You can eat 'em and still have the seeds left over. The thing about seeds is they last from 1 year to the next. While all the world is sleeping, the seeds are sleeping too. But when spring comes, they're ready to wake up and grow. That's the way a tree remembers tomorrow." Young Jethro took a big bite out of the apple and saw one of the dark seeds at the core. It seemed so small, and yet he knew it would grow into a tree. "Thank you," young Jethro said to Johnny. "Don't worry about thanking me," Johnny said. "You just thank the tree." Outside the cabin, Paul Bunyan chuckled at Johnny Appleseed's wisdom about a tree. Paul knew about trees. Some you chop down and some you grow. In all his life, Paul Bunyan had never chopped down an apple tree. He started to say something about this when they were all interrupted by another voice. It was such a deep voice that it sounded like an echo from the bottom of an old rain barrel. "Hey there!" the voice bellowed. "Anybody home?" Both young Jethro and Johnny Appleseed looked up in surprise. Neither of them had expected to see anybody else in the forest. "Who could that be?" Young Jethro asked. He knew it wasn't Paul Bunyan because the toe of Paul's boot was still poked close to the fireplace. Young Jethro went to the cabin door and looked out. Halfway across the clearing stood the greatest frontiersman of them all, Daniel Boone. Young Jethro knew it was Daniel Boone from the pictures his father had shown him. By this time, Daniel Boone was standing in front of the cabin. Young Jethro's eyes widened in wonder. What had he done to deserve 3 such wonderful guests? Paul Bunyan, Johnny Appleseed, and now Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone looked over the trees young Jethro had chopped down. Then he said he thought young Jethro was just about the best frontiersman he had ever heard tell of. Why, imagine clearing away all that land and taking care of the cabin all by himself. You did a good job, boy. Just the right way. You took out all the ones that were doing poorly and left the rest. It takes a good frontiersman to know how to do that. Well, thank you, Mr. Boone, young Jethro said. Daniel Boone was so pleased that he came into the cabin and sat by the fireplace for a while. And just like young Jethro's father, he told the boy a story. It was the story known to everybody as the incident at Rogers Creek. It seemed that one time Daniel Boone was surrounded by hostile Indians.
One pitch dark night on Rogers Creek, I heard a twig go snap. It was a sign the foe was near and I was in a trap.
Were you lost?
No, just bewildered.
Were you caught?
No, just surrounded.
Were you brave and were you courageous?
Well, wait and see. And when I heard that twig go snap, I found a hollow log. I knew they'd never find me there. Beside there was a fog. Inside that log I hid myself. I heard their feet go by. There must have been 1,000 braves while I was only I. They pitched their camp around that log and then they went to sleep. There was no chance for my escape. Those braves would hear me creep.
Golly, what happened then?
There was a mouse inside that log. That mouse began to squeak. An Indian gave that log a kick and rolled it to the creek. I crawled outside and swam ashore, and thus I got away. Those Indians never saw me once, that's why I'm here today. Was I lost?
No, just bewildered.
Was I caught?
No, just surrounded.
Was I brave and was I courageous?
But what happened to that mouse?
That wasn't a mouse. That was me. That's what you call escaping by a narrow squeak.
After he finished his story, Daniel Boone began fussing with a package he held in his hands. He untied it behind his back, and when it was all loose, he whipped it out in front of him and held it up for everyone to see. It was a buckskin jacket with fringe. I hope it fits, Daniel Boone said. It's a kind of magical shirt. Gives you courage. He handed the shirt to young Jethro, who ran inside the cabin to try it on. It fit him perfectly. And Daniel Boone was right. It did seem to give Jethro courage, just like Johnny Appleseed had given him hope, and Paul Bunyan had given him strength. Young Jethro stepped outside the cabin again. "Oh, boy, look how it fits," he shouted as he danced around the clearing. When he stopped dancing and looked up, everyone was gone. The clearing looked exactly as it had before, except that one of the tall trees looked like Paul Bunyan, and a smaller tree looked like Johnny Appleseed with a pack on his back. The third tree, with a fringe of icicles on its branches, looked like Daniel Boone. All three of them seemed to be guarding Jethro's cabin in the bright moonlight. The next thing young Jethro knew, it was Christmas morning. He woke to find himself lying in his bed. He couldn't remember how he had gotten there. He felt his arm to see if he still had on the buckskin jacket. Instead, he felt the flannel nightgown he always wore. He tried not to feel disappointed as he stared at the ceiling of his little attic room. He could hear his mother making breakfast below. The smell of frying bacon drifted up to him, and he felt hungry. He remembered now that he hadn't eaten supper the night before. He put on his shirt and trousers and climbed down the birch pole ladder. When he turned around, the first thing he saw was a Christmas tree. Gleaming sparklers shone from its branches. "Merry Christmas, son," his father called out cheerily. "Merry Christmas, boy," his mother added. But young Jethro hardly heard them. His eyes were fixed on the Christmas tree, the first one they had ever had. Underneath the tree were 3 presents. "Merry Christmas to you," young Jethro said softly. "You were sleeping mighty sound when we finally got through that storm last night," his father said. "For a time we thought we'd never make it." Young Jethro continued to stare at the tree. His father tried to pretend there was nothing unusual in the occasion, but there was a distinct note of pride in his voice as he said, "Say, what are those things under the tree? Look like presents." "Wonder who they're for," his mother said. "Open them and see," said his father. "Can I?" asked young Jethro. "Go right ahead," his father said. "What are you waiting for?" Young Jethro knelt beside the tree. Pepper wagged his tail anxiously beside him. First, there was a long green package. Young Jethro opened it very slowly. He could feel some kind of handle. Quickly, he tore the paper away. It was an axe. "An axe!" young Jethro cried. He held it in his hands. It had a dark hickory handle, and the blade was gleaming. He carefully laid the axe down beside him and reached for the next package. The second package was wrapped in blue. It felt like a ball, but when he tore the paper away, he found an apple, a rosy red apple just like Johnny Appleseed's. He kissed the apple and put it next to the axe. The third package was wrapped in red, almost the color of the apple. It was soft and kind of limp when he held it in his hands. He tore away the paper, and there was a buckskin jacket with fringe on it. Young Jethro quickly took off his own shirt and tried it on. It fit him perfectly. "It fits," he shouted, and he danced around the room. "Look at that, it fits!" And then he remembered what he had dreamed the night before. All of it had seemed so real. He stopped his dancing and went to the window and looked across the snow-covered field. The trees were still there, and still in need of chopping. "What are you looking for?" his father asked him. "Oh, nothing," young Jethro said. "I was going to give you a surprise. I was going to clear away that whole field out there. But your axe was too heavy. Maybe we can do it together now, his father said. It shouldn't take too long with that axe of yours. His mother called, "Breakfast's ready." Young Jethro and his father started for the kitchen. "Maybe one day we could have a fair-sized garden patch," young Jethro said, "and maybe some space for an apple tree." "Someday soon, son," his father replied. "Someday soon." Then young Jethro thought about the stars. He would be able to see so many more of them now. Soon he would have to learn to count to more than 100. He leaned the axe against the wall next to the table. He put the apple in the middle of the table where it looked like the most beautiful decoration in the world. He would save it for later in the day, and then he would eat it. But he remembered what Johnny Appleseed had said about saving the seeds. When spring came, he would plant them in the ground. They all sat down to breakfast and bowed their heads in prayer. Far in the distance, young Jethro thought he could hear 3 familiar voices singing on the wind.
Remember the child who was born on this day. How lovely is Christmas with songs in the air. A bright Merry Christmas, dear friends.